Hello, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit more about World of Warcraft. Today I want to talk about three really big design elements that have had a permanent, lasting, and very, very important and deep impact on the way World of Warcraft has been experienced and also the way it has developed since its launch. I'm going to talk a lot today about a concept that I call reflexive game design. This is a concept that is kind of born out of my own mind and my own analysis of things as a gamer. Not as a developer, but as a person who plays a lot of games, and as a writer too, I guess, in just my general analytical mind. And I'm happy to, in fact, I encourage you to help me develop this concept, help me to refine it, maybe even rename it if we can find a more appropriate name than reflexive game design. But here's the idea, is that you created a game design element in a game, and that design element reflexively alters what has to be done with other design elements in the future. And it does this by altering the player's perception, experiences, and their expectations for what's going to happen in the future, so that your future game design has been affected by this original decision. That's kind of what I call reflexive game design. And we get to see it a lot in World of Warcraft, because World of Warcraft, unlike games that have discrete versions of games, World of Warcraft has one continuous version of the game that's been updated for 11 years. I know that there's expansions that are like big pieces of content, but there's all these patches in between where the developers are making conscious design decisions. They're updating the design. They're changing the way the game works. They're trying to improve things, improve graphics, and get rid of bugs. There's a constant revision of what World of Warcraft is. And so that makes it a really good case study for just what reflexive game design can do and what it means in a bigger context. Versus, and that's in contrast to games like Call of Duty, where there's one that comes out every single year, and the reflexive part of it, that the game design changes have to do with what happened in a previous version. And then you have a new distinct version, and you're not making a lot of design choices while that distinct version is current. You wait till the next version comes out the next year. Or like, Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, 3, where, you have a game design element in Super Mario Brothers 1 that is jumping, and that influences all the stuff that you put in all the other games. But because they're discrete entities, we don't have a great idea of which design element affected what in what order. But with Warcraft, we get to see it all put together. So the first one that I want to look at is actually one that a game design element that was not added to the game post-launch, but was added to the game pre-launch, that most people would really not even think about as a game design decision, but it was actually a really big one, and that was instanced dungeons. The idea of dungeon content that is separate from the world. It was actually kind of novel when the game was being developed. If you look back at 2003, 2004, 2005, the big kid on the block as far as MMOs was EverQuest, especially PvE MMOs. And EverQuest did not have separate instances of content. They had one gigantic game world, and your raid content was in a raid zone. And if you logged into that raid zone and there was another raid already in there killing a boss, you couldn't kill that boss that day. And some bosses had a long respawn timer, like a day or a couple days, sometimes a week, which meant if you wanted to do certain content, you had to negotiate who was doing what content when, who was making what attempts when, with other guilds in order to figure out how you were going to do the content. Instancing allows you to have as many different versions of that particular piece of content as you want. So there's an advantage. You no longer have to negotiate with other guilds. Every guild can work at their own pace to do whatever content they are. And also, as you go down below max level, down to all the other dungeons, you can have, if there's a concentration of people in one level area, they can still, all do the same thing because you can spawn an infinite number of instances. That's actually a big advantage. There are disadvantages. There are trade-offs, right? Because as soon as you stop having to negotiate about who's doing what, you are actually removing a little piece of the social aspect. A lot of people don't think of WoW that way because we think of WoW as starting with this like pristine element, but the developers, I am assuming, made lots of decisions going into World of Warcraft to how to make the best experience possible for people. And I think instances provided a lot of trade-offs for that. Indeed, instances have been like one of the most constant pieces of World of Warcraft and one of the most popular and enduring ideas in World of Warcraft. So much so that I think modern content or modern thoughts about World of Warcraft tend to focus around those instanced dungeons at the end of the game, the big raid dungeons that Everyone really wants to have lots of access to, and wants to have lots of quantity of, and not so much. So the focus is on those, and not so much the open world aspect, the running around to mobs where there's an unlimited number of people. And the big difference between an instance dungeon and the open world in World of Warcraft is that in the open, what we would call the open world now, there's no restrictions on anything. You can have 100 people in one area, or you can have 2 or 1. There's nothing restricting the number of people that you bring in. But with an instance dungeon, there's an upper limit. There's a cap. You can only bring in 5 people for lots of dungeons. For others, it's 10. For others, it's 25, depending on the expansion, up to 40 if you're doing 40-man vanilla content. So that upper limit also, in turn, has a reflexive effect on what you do within that content. Because you have that upper limit, you're not narrowing the difficulty that's available to the player. Or you're able to narrow the difficulty for them. Out in the open world, if you're one person and you're walking around, killing some mobs, well, that might be challenging. You get a second person, now it's like twice as easy because you have that extra person helping you. If you have 5 people, it might be incredibly easy, and then you can do something like kill higher level monsters or something like that. So the difficulty level varies a lot based on the number of people that you bring. In a raid or a dungeon, you have that cap, 5 people. Actually, you could raid dead mines, by the way. Little aside. You used to be able to raid dead mines, and it used to be actually kind of necessary. For a long time, the game didn't give you anything but like grays until dead mines. So you kind of had to bring extra people if you actually wanted to do dead mines. That's just a little aside. But you have that limit. You have that upper limit of people that you can bring. How that affects the design of the content that's in there, because it narrows the difficulty, that means you can create a really consistent experience in terms of difficulty. You can have a very well scripted encounter, knowing that you're going to have exactly that many people to deal with a given player versus environment challenge. So in a raid, you know that somebody's going to bring 25 people. You can create a scenario where the raid has to split up in a certain way in order to accomplish the objectives, and know that you're going to deal with exactly 25 people, not 80 people. You're not going to have 80 people coming in and zerging down the content, which means you can create a lot better scripted environment. And that's a big positive too. That's the thing that I think people really think of with World of Warcraft PvE experiences, is having to coordinate those people to overcome that very particular specific challenge. Now, there are ways that you can overcome the set challenge of a dungeon. One of the ways is you can outlevel the dungeon. So if you are wanting to do dead mines and you're level 30, obviously you're not going to need to bring like 5 people to do dead mines. You might even be able to solo it, but you'll probably have to bring like a couple people. So that becomes easier. But at the same time, you don't get as many rewards. The whole idea of creating a challenging system also allowed Blizzard to create really good rewards for a high challenge. But obviously, if you're higher level, then those rewards are going to be lower. The other option would be to outgear a dungeon. So if you're thinking of like max level raids, you have better gear from higher level dungeons. You go back to Karazhan or whatever it is, and it's all of a sudden very easy because you don't have to work as hard. You're doing more damage automatically, which lowers the difficulty threshold of what you're doing. So but those are the ways that you can overcome the difficulty. Whereas in an open world environment, you can overcome it in any way you want to, including like kiting mobs or something that we don't even think about as like a way to get around the difficulty of content. So the other thing I did mention rewards. Because you set that difficulty reflexively, it lets you create highly scripted, very difficult encounters, which in turn lets you create more epic rewards. An epic accomplishment deserves an epic reward or a legendary reward. So to get like a legendary item requires a whole bunch of work with coordinating 40 people and doing difficult bosses and getting lots of items and collecting them, and then getting 5 people to go in and forge it inside of a BRD if you're doing hand to rag. All those things are part of the reflexive nature of that design. Once you have that set number of people that can do it, all of a sudden you can create better content. You can create better rewards, knowing that you have a very set challenge level that doesn't have a lot of variety to it. And that produces a really good effect for people. Other reflexive design things that have happened from the introduction of dungeons. Like I said, there was that trade-off where you're not out in the open world anymore. And I think, especially early in the game design, the designers probably knew this, which is why early dungeon instances, particularly in vanilla, are like buried behind tons of elite mobs out in the open world, because they wanted that content to feel like it was still part of a dangerous world. So like with Dead Mines, you had to walk through this endless series of caves with a bunch of elites in them to finally get to the dungeon portal to go into your instance with your 5-man group and do the scripted encounter. You still had to do a lot of interaction out in the open world. So they were kind of trying to balance that trade-off of feeling like you're not in the open world by kind of putting the instances behind a lot of elites and making it a challenge to get to the instance. And I do appreciate that design element. They chose to remove that later on because people were so interested in doing these dungeons. They didn't want things getting in the way of that. I think there's some negative trade-offs to getting rid of that particular level of thing. The other thing about dungeons is that because you had instanced PvE content, it was only natural that you were going to end up with instanced PvP content in the form of battlegrounds. People really like battlegrounds because they feel a lot more even than what you get in the open world. Out in the open world, there's no restrictions. You could have a 10-man gank squad running around killing people, but inside a battleground, it's 10 on 10, 15 on 15, 40 on 40. It's balanced at least in the terms of numbers. It's not balanced in terms of gear. It's not balanced in terms of skill, but at least you feel like you're not getting zerged down. So there's a lot of advantages to the instanced PvP as well. And I think instance PvP was a future design decision because the game didn't ship with instance PvP based on people's experiences with dungeons and this idea of balance and fairness and that sort of thing. So that's the first really big game design decision, and it's definitely been probably the biggest one in terms of affecting how people understand and think about World of Warcraft are these instanced dungeons. So much though that I might even suggest a future expansion where they don't do any open world content. They just give people a bunch of instances to do, and that's the way you level, is by going right into the scripted content rather than having to do a bunch of open world exploration and that kind of stuff, which the current population may not be as interested in as the original players of the game were. So anyway, that's that. And I will say that there's been some changes to that upper limit of what can be brought that I should also mention have had a little bit of that reflexive effect. When the game shipped, there weren't any 40-man raids immediately. There were like 5 and 10-mans. A lot of people that jumped into the game had guilds from other games. Multi-gaming guilds are still around, but a lot of people jumped into World of Warcraft. They introduced the 40-man raid, and that was actually stepped down from EverQuest. EverQuest had like 76 or 80-man raids. They were really big. So with the 40-man raid, it's still pretty big. You had to construct a guild to do that 40-man content. Once you had guilds doing 40-man content, that in turn reflexively caused Blizzard to make other design decisions about raids, namely that you got to start introducing things like resist fights. Like Princess Huhuran is one of the ones I think of, or indeed some of the encounters in Molten Core, where you had to put your guild resources together to go out and make fire resist gear so that you could get past this encounter. And you were able to ask players to do that because you knew that they were assembling guilds to accomplish really big things in the game, to overcome these obstacles. And we sort of saw resist fights go away, I think, in Wrath of the Lich King. We stopped doing the resist fight thing, but we did it in Burning Crusade. And the guild size had shrunk in Burning Crusade because they changed that upper limit. The upper limit was 40. 40 produced a really big guild with a lot of resources and an ability to coordinate lots of people to do resists. Once you lowered that level to 25, guilds automatically shrank. They split and they shrank because you don't want to have a 70-person guild when you can only bring 25 to your raid. So your guild split to 2 25-man raids. That's a trade-off. It's easier to come up with 25 people. It's easier to tune 25-man content to a specific skill and gear level than 40. 40 people has a lot of variance in it. And you could see with the number of guilds that really died on Naxx is that level of variance when it was put to the test in vanilla was found wanting in a lot of cases. But in Burning Crusade, we still had resist fights. You still had, I believe there was an arcane resist fight in Tempest Keep. There was an arcane resist fight, I think the first boss in SSC, Serpent Shrine Caverns, where you had to have frost and nature resist. And so people had to sort of farm those things out, and you could craft them. And they made it a little bit easier to get the resists in Burning Crusade, but people still didn't really like it because now it was much harder to coordinate a guild to get that. Back in vanilla, people had to go kill these world dragons to get the nature resist pieces, to make this like wall of people with nature resist in Princess Huhuran. But now, once you shrink the guild level down, it's a little harder to do that open world content, a little harder to coordinate people to do that. So that in turn makes it so like maybe we'll just get rid of this because the player base is not having a good time trying to figure out how to do resist fights. And then with Wrath of the Lich King, you had now options to do all the raids as 10-man raids, which caused a bunch of guilds to split again and shrink back down to 10 men. Basically, whatever the minimum amount of people you can bring, that's going to start to become the average guild size. And I think we've seen that since Wrath of the Lich King. There's a lot more guilds that do like 10-man stuff. And even with flex raids, they do like 10, 15 people. The big corporate 40-man guilds are long gone. And even the 25-man guilds are becoming much more rare because there's, unless you're doing mythic stuff, there's no reason to try to create a 25-man team, so to speak. So that's another bit of reflexive design. As you lower that upper cap, that changes a lot about what the player base is doing to organize themselves to accomplish it, which in turn influences how you're going to present future game design decisions. All this has to do with the next thing that I really want to talk about, which is this guy right here, the Dungeon Finder. The Dungeon Finder's the second big game design decision that they've made. This was made at the end of Wrath of the Lich King, but they had attempted to make things like this well before Wrath of the Lich King to help people to do dungeon content, because dungeon content was like the thing to do. It had the best rewards, but it was challenging. It required more than one person, and people were trying to find lots of ways to do it. The first thing that they came up with was actually this thing, the Meeting Stone. The original Meeting Stone was pretty awful. You went out to the Meeting Stone at the instance and you clicked it, and it put you in a queue with people, and it was supposed to auto add you into a group. But it's one of those things like if everybody's just going out to this stone to click on it, then we just have our group, right? Then they added it so innkeepers can put you in a group. But if you did actually ended up in a queue and like put into a group, you had no idea who was going to be in your group, and those groups usually failed. So people just didn't use them. They chose to make their own groups and looking for group. And it's interesting that the Meeting Stones, the original version of the Meeting Stones, failed because they added Meeting Stones to content that was already fairly challenging. And the response to that was, these don't work because they're not producing. I never get in a group, and when I do get in a group, it fails. Right? That was the problem with Meeting Stones. They didn't end up changing their content, like nerfing the content so that people in the Meeting Stone queue could actually accomplish the dungeons. People just chose not to use the Meeting Stones. Later on, Meeting Stones were used to summon people to the instance, which made things a lot easier to get out to an instance. But Dungeon Finder is when everything changed. This came in at the end of Wrath of the Lich King. And what it did was you queued up for a dungeon, and it would automatically put you into a group based on what roles you said you could do. And then not only would it automatically put you in that group, it would automatically port you to the dungeon of your choice. So no longer did you have to do this original thing where you had to go all the way out to the instance. There's a Meeting Stone in the back right there. Go all the way out to the instance. Find your way through the crowd of elite mobs all the way down to the instance with your group. Fight your way all the way to the instance and then get to do the content. Now you were automatically put in a group. That group was automatically ported to the dungeon, and then you could go do it. Now, the time that this came out, it was viewed very positively by a lot of people, and for good reason, is that it really sped up the process of chain running heroics to get like the whatever the badges were at the time. You used to get badges from these dungeon bosses that you could use to buy gear and kind of catch up on the gear curve and that kind of stuff. Well, at the time that came out, like in the last patch with Wrath of the Lich King, like the ICC patch. Maybe a little before it, but I feel like it somewhere around that time, maybe Trial of the Crusader. But at the time it came out, people were really, really well geared. People had all epics. It wasn't people getting queued into a dungeon in greens and blues. They had epics, and they were able to face roll through those with a bunch of strangers with no communication. Everyone knew the encounters because they'd been doing them for a whole year. The expansion had been out for close to a year when the Dungeon Finder came out. So everyone knew the encounters and was already well overgeared for them, which meant that this was a benefit. When it had the reflexive effect, and when it created some negatives, is when the next expansion came out. When Cataclysm came out, the 5-man heroic dungeons were fairly hard. They tuned them harder than the Wrath of the Lich King heroics, because they felt like we want heroics to be heroic again. In the Burning Crusade, heroics were very difficult. To do all the heroics to get your Tempest key, or your Tempest Keep key to get your attunement to go into Tempest Keep, was a lot of work. And those heroics were like you had to do like 6 heroics, and it was all the hardest ones. So it was a difficult thing to accomplish in your tier 4, so that then you could have access to your tier 5. But heroics and Wrath of the Lich King were easier. That also kind of cues into this. Well, when they wanted to make them harder again to give that more satisfied feeling from accomplishing a heroic, people were very, very... There was a lot of complaints on the forums over the way that the dungeons were at the beginning of Cataclysm. They were difficult. Now, I didn't really have a hard time with them because I was in a guild. I had my friends. We were all good at this game. So we rolled in. We really enjoyed them. But we did find, if we ever did the Dungeon Finder, that the group just failed miserably every single time. Well, their response to that was then to lower the difficulty level of those dungeons so that people could do them in the Dungeon Finder. And that's a great example of that reflexive design, is that once you've implemented this little piece of design and can't really go back on it, you have to start making future elements of your game conform to the needs that were created by this design element. So once this thing was in the game, it was kind of like Pandora's box. We couldn't put things back in the box, so you ended up nerfing the content. This concept kept going once we had Raid Finder. And Raid Finder, I'm not really a fan of. I'm not a big fan of Raid Finder. When Raid Finder was introduced, that's really when I felt like I needed to quit the game, because I knew it would be quite bad for the player base, and I think it's had a lot of negative effects on the player base. That's not to say it's all bad, because again, I think in terms of trade-offs. And the trade-off was that you had this a lot of people complaining for the first 3 expansions or so, and even in Wrath of the Lich King, people were complaining that they were paying this money and they were not getting to see the content. That there were these raids that they couldn't get into because they didn't, raid 5 days a week with an elite guild or something like that. So we create Raid Finder, which lowers the difficulty of it, automatically puts you in a raid and lets you see the content, and even gives you epic loot for doing it. The problem with that is that anybody who's playing the game in order to see the end of the game, they're not going to be really motivated to go find a really good guild to be in and improve their skills so that they can then see what they want to see. You can just kind of queue into the Raid Finder and go for it. Well, the use of the Raid Finder in turn is going to reflexively affect what's going on. Having a guild becomes less and less of a thing because you can see the content on your own. You have to start designing for people who are playing the game solo, so the solo content has to be much more soloable, and the LFR content has to be easier, to the point where, like in Warlords of Draenor, the looking for raid stuff was you could almost be AFK and be at the top of the charts. That's what it was. Like, you could click auto shot on your hunter and go get a drink and come back, and the boss would be dead and no one would care. That's where LFR ended up going. That might be good for some people, because some people just want to, I want to pay my $15 a month, PvP a little bit, go in, see the LFR content, and get out. So I'm not going to say it's all bad for everyone, but it did have this kind of effect on the game. And then you end up with Warlords of Draenor, you have 4 levels of content. You have LFR, and then normal, flex, and then heroic, flex, and then mythic. 4 levels of the same stuff, and not everyone's going to be excited about doing 4 different levels of the same thing. They'll just see 1 level of it and be like, okay, I'm good, and then they'll be doing something else. So that's the second big one, is the Dungeon Finder. I think overall the Dungeon Finder's been negative for the entire concept of the game, for the entire overall effect of the way the game works. That's my opinion on that. I'm not a big fan of the Dungeon Finder. It would be nice to go back to the way things were before Dungeon Finder. It's not perfect. People came up with lots of ways. You had an LFR channel and all this kind of stuff to try to find groups. But it's a little bit better than what you get with the LFR stuff, where you have literally random people. You'll never see them again. There's no consequence to being bad. And because people get so bad at LFR, then that lowers how hard they're going to make LFR. They're going to make LFR easier and easier and easier to do until anyone can do it without having to put in any kind of effort. And that's basically what happened in Warlords of Draenor. It had this reflexive effect. The last thing that I really want to talk about, I'll talk briefly about, which is flying. Flying mounts are something that was introduced in the first expansion, Burning Crusade. And they're something that had a massive and long-lasting impact on the game, in so much as it created a now constant expectation that you need to have flying in the game. Once you introduce flying, and of course they made flying rather expensive. It costs like $1,000 to get your slow flying mount, and $1,000 gold. It costs 5,000 gold to get an epic flying mount. I even remember a story where a woman slept with a man to get the 5,000 gold for her epic flying mount, and it was like a story because 5,000 gold was rather difficult to get. Well, once you charge somebody a huge amount of their in-game currency to get something, of course they're going to want to keep using it. So when you come out with Wrath of the Lich King, you have flying in that expansion too, because people have spent their 5,000 gold on each character to fly fast. Then when you come out with Cataclysm, you're with another challenge. We want to bring people back to the old world, but we have to add flying, and the old world wasn't designed for flying. So now we have to spend a lot of resources designing it for flying, because people now have the expectation that they're going to be able to fly everywhere. So then we'll fast forward to Warlords of Draenor, and they take flying out of the game. That was very exciting for me, because I like the idea of a more ground-centered room. All the combat happens on the ground, so I wanted ground combat. I wanted ground level mounts. It also keeps the world kind of dangerous. They went away from that. I can talk about some other time. They went away from that. But I was excited about that. But no sooner did they do that everyone wanted flying back. So again, it had a reflexive effect. The other thing was the original content was designed to, like I said, to be done on the ground. You fought everything on the ground. You had a ground mount. And once you had flying, there wasn't flying combat. There are games that have flying combat, like Aeon did it really well. World of Warcraft doesn't have it and didn't have it. So you would fly, once you had flying, you would fly to the monster you wanted to kill, drop down, kill him, then off you go. Well, that changes a lot about the way that the game is designed. If you have a big field of mobs, now that big field of mobs kind of becomes irrelevant if you're asking someone to do it on a flying mount. So we go to Wrath of the Lich King, and there's two zones designed for flying mounts. You no longer have to make every part of the zone accessible from the ground. You can design things in sort of 3 dimensions. And so you had Storm Peaks and the Ice Crown Citadel zone. I think it was just called Ice Crown. That had lots of different levels on them, but you still fought people on the ground, but you could fly up, fly down. You didn't have to have a field of mobs that people have to fight through and sneak through to get to one. You just can make that one mob like inside a cave. You have to do a bunch of things in order to kind of create that same effect once you have flying in the game. And a lot of people like flying. They like exploring. They like seeing things from above. From a game design perspective, I think the trade-offs are more negative than positive. But once you put flying in the game, again, it's kind of like a Pandora's box. You can't just take it away. People now have this expectation. You have to design content with the idea that people are going to have flying in mind. And that changes a lot about what you want to do. So the World of Warcraft now has changed a lot over the last 11 years. It's gone from a game that was very, very focused on the ground and very much about a dangerous world to a game that's very, very focused on instanced content. And I think that focus on instanced content is also kind of added to by the flying mounts, because the flying mount allows you to not really have to do as much in the open world to get whatever resources you want. You can get those resources, fly away, and then focus on the raids. But those are the 3 big ones that I think have had the most long-lasting reflexive effect on the game. Please let me know what you think about this. Please let me know what you think about my idea about reflexive game design that then informs future decisions and forces future decisions to be in a different direction from what they otherwise might be. Please let me know what you think about that and what you think about my points about these 3 design decisions. I will talk about other design decisions in another video. I might make like a top 10 list of bad design decisions. For right now, I'm not trying to say that any of these are bad or good, but they have trade-offs that maybe affect the end quality of the game in a way that you may not like. I prefer the vanilla version of the game very much. I really liked Burning Crusade, and I liked Wrath of the Lich King. Wrath of the Lich King was probably the last expansion that I had a lot of fun in. But it was also kind of the beginning of the end because of these design decisions that continue to roll along and affect the way that the game feels in the future. So anyway, thanks for watching. I really, really appreciate it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You can visit my websites down below, dvspress.com, davidvstewart.com, where I have like most of my fiction stuff. And I really, really appreciate you watching and giving me your thoughts. You guys have a great, great day.